this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today I'm here with my good friend and colleague Candace Tal, and I, as most people know, wrote a week-long series of blog posts on the life cycle management of third-party relationships. In, I think, day 3 or post 3, I wrote about due diligence, and I quoted Candace extensively from a guest post that she was kind enough to write for me sometime back about deep dive due diligence. So that gave me an excuse to call her up and see what she was up to, and it turned out she's up to some pretty exciting things. The reason I called her up just to talk to her was to see if I could get her on the podcast to talk about deep dive due diligence, because I really don't know anybody who talks about it better, knows about it better, and can articulate it better. So she graciously agreed to come on the podcast, explain to us what a deep dive due diligence is, why it's important, and how it really differs from other levels of due diligence, and how people might think through the different levels of due diligence, how they might think through the levels of risk, and how they might think through how they would need someone like Candace, her company, and her services when they reach a level of risk, and then how, when she told me about some of the things that initiatives her company was up to, I became very excited, and I asked her if she might share them with some of our listeners, and she said, happy to talk about them, so we're going to visit with those maybe at the end. So Candace, thanks very much for coming on. I appreciate you taking the time to visit with us, and belated Happy Easter.
Thanks, Tom. Belated Happy Easter to you too.
So you're really the first person, or the only person I know who talks about a deep dive due diligence. What do you mean by that?
Well, deep dive due diligence is finding information that is both disclosed and undisclosed information. And a lot of companies today start with a very preliminary level of due diligence, which of course is more cost effective, inexpensive to conduct. And for large companies that have several 100,000 third-party agents, conducting that kind of deep-level due diligence might be difficult initially, at least at the beginning of a program. They have to rank and screen their third-party agents. So a very typical cost-effective solution is the first-level anti-money laundering, anti-corruption lists, database searches. Deep-level due diligence is really about going in-country, understanding the local language, local culture, understanding local politics, and getting much deeper level of information. Some of that can be done desktop, other parts of it need to be conducted in the field, so to speak.
You know, I'm not sure maybe all my listeners know your background and why you're able to speak so authoritatively on this. You've had quite a long run in this field, so maybe you could share that with some of our listeners.
Sure. So I've owned my business for almost 30 years. Actually, next March will be 30 years. And we've always conducted, we're a global security and investigations agency. And we specialize in business due diligence, risk assessment, threat assessments globally, and have done the entire virtually 30 years worth. We work internationally, globally through affiliates of ours that we've known for personally, in most cases, for over 20, 25 years. And that constitutes a much more effective way of conducting global due diligence for clients.
One of the things I think people struggle with is you articulated several levels of due diligence. So, for instance, I have a license from World Compliance, and I'm pretty comfortable that I can do a level 1 due diligence check with the noted limitations that it has, and I can tell people, you know, I can check an OFAC list, I can check an SDN list, and I can tell you if someone's a government official, that sort of thing. Are they a PEP? Above that, there are companies that can perform a more in-depth check. But when it gets to really knowing, discovering about the in-country information, the intelligence that's not available in an English language database search, how do you or your affiliates really ferret out that information, and why is that important for a company that's going to enter a long-term contractual relationship with a third party in a country outside the United States?
There's a great deal of information that we can find through an investigation here in the US, but it's only a portion of the information that's available in other countries. Not only the public records domain information, which is the easy to find information, if you will. It's the public records information that you're very familiar with, and most companies are familiar with, looking at OFAC and SDN lists and so forth, all the different global sanction lists. However, that information gives you a level of detail that's really cursory in the sense that when you, if you're a company that has already been found on someone's radar, they've been accused of bribery or corruption or aiding or abetting terrorist organizations, so on and so forth, those companies would be found on those kinds of public domain lists. However, that's only a portion of the information that you would find if you look at that company globally, regionally, on a local level. You may find, for example, that in small organizations, we look at this particularly for FCPA compliance of smaller companies in emerging markets, for example. There's not much available in public record in those domains. In Africa, for example, there aren't really any lists to look at. They're very in China, there are very limited lists available. Russia, also, very limited lists to look at. So that's not sufficient level of due diligence to really understand the scope of, is there risk present in that country? So, for example, you might look at the standard anti-money laundering lists, of which are about 380 global lists. Some companies think it's 800 lists, but actually a lot of those are fluff. They're just reproduced lists with a new name. Those lists only provide that limited information that we mentioned earlier. It doesn't tell you, for example, if the company hasn't made it to one of those lists. It doesn't tell you if a company is in high-tech or telecommunications, for example, they should have a website. And if they're a small entity, they may or may not have a website presence yet. Does that mean there's risk or there's no risk? So if you only run the level 1 database analysis on its own, all you'll find is that they don't appear in anybody's list yet because nothing's been found about them. But when you go in country and you find out that the company, nobody shows up for work there, for example, that might be a red flag or a yellow flag. Perhaps it's not a big issue. Maybe it's a regional or satellite office that nobody goes to. And so there's a lot of information like that that falls through the cracks and doesn't get picked up at all in questionnaires and surveys, compliance surveys that companies routinely run in addition to their level 1 reviews. So that would be a level 2 or level 3 review, for example.
One of the things you said that you and your company routinely or perhaps provide is political intelligence or risk assessments broader than anti-corruption. Obviously, I practice in the anti-corruption and anti-bribery space, and many of my colleagues, we I don't want to say limit ourselves, but we tend to have blinders limited to anti-corruption and anti-bribery, and people like yourself tend to view things a little broader. You have a broader perspective. You look at things broader because that's the nature of what you bring to the table. And so one of the things I'm intrigued with when I visit with people like yourself is that broader perspective. So you might consider a political risk, whereas that typically I wouldn't look at that. And so I'm always intrigued by how do you educate a company about political risk in a company, in a country, or other types of risk that they may not initially ask you to assess?
Mm-hmm. Well, some of that information will come up through what we consider to be level 2 searches, where we're looking at deep media searches, deep internet searches. We'll find out information, for example, about people's political affiliations, or the company executive, the chief executive officer, chairman of the board, whoever it might be, and take a look at how are they operating in country? How are they operating in terms of contracts that might appear innocuous initially, In other words, the fact that a company has a large-scale contract or a multi-million-dollar contract with a government agency doesn't necessarily mean that they are operating corruptly. However, the opportunity may exist there and warrants further exploration. Companies that have connections through friends, relatives, family members, that might not seem obvious at first. So that would be another way of looking at political areas of political influence or relationships that involve political influence or undue influence. We have looked at investigation in a small country where a sales manager, for example, was involved in a bribery matter. And it was not it wouldn't have been anything that would come up on anyone's list because it hasn't been prosecuted yet. So a lot of information is available in the not in the public record domain. It's not private necessarily. It's still discoverable in the sense of finding it in public domain being public records domain rather than the internet or social media searches, that type of thing. So we distinguish between those three areas. When you bring them all together, the databases, the combination of the databases, public deep internet searches, not just a Google search because that won't reveal very much, of course, deep media searches, historical media searches, and you conduct investigative analysis, that enables us to come up with much more substantial pointers. It's still not deep level due diligence yet, but it's on the way. It's much more effective as a risk management, a risk assessment tool than doing conducting only the global database checks. And of course, tied into that would be the Transparency International, Corruption Perception Index, and so forth. So the level 2 check is much more in-depth. It will reveal information such as political relationships, in addition to other items that might not be typically found in the databases alone. And from that, we can derive a set of conclusions, actionable results, if you will, that lead to actionable recommendations for the client to decide what level of risk they need to assign to that particular company or its executives. And then from there, the company would rank those, typically we see red, yellow, green. Oftentimes there's more to discuss about the red, yellow, green flags. However, that enables you to make an initial risk assessment based on additional facts than just the databases alone.
I see. If I could turn subject a little bit, I've heard you talk about also doing investigations of senior executives, or perhaps looking at either bringing executives on board or promoting employees to senior executive positions. Is that something that you all help companies do?
Yes, definitely. We've been doing executive due diligence for 30 years also.
And why do you believe that's important for companies to engage in?
It's extremely important for companies, particularly publicly traded companies, but I would say all companies should screen their executives for a wide variety of particular issues. We find that about 20% of executives do not check out very well at all. A large percentage of those issues are in the typical variety of things that we see with other employees, such as criminal history, education, lack of degree, etc. But there are other issues, such as things that might get the company into headline situations. So it would be taking a look at about 25 to 30 public records areas, and then analyzing the information to determine what else might be missing. Has the person disclosed everything to you that you should know about? Are they serving on the board of directors of their brother's company, and it could be perceived as a potential kickback situation, for example, depending what the issues are and the type of businesses that both are in, obviously. So we see things like felony fraud that has been undisclosed. Of course, someone that's a con artist is going to sign any legal document that you present to them. in the hopes that you won't check it and won't verify the information. So we see a large suite of issues that arise. Another category of issues that's very important at the executive level are SEC violations, civil lawsuits, litigiousness, litigation history, in other words, and so on and so forth. There are a very wide variety of issues that come up at the executive level. Things like real estate. We've seen money laundering through real estate records when nothing else was found. It was the only red flag. If the individual has come from another country, it certainly behooves the company to explore their past in that other country. Certain Eastern Bloc countries have had issues with executives that were involved in money laundering, move over to the US or move to Europe and then eventually to the US, for example, and have a long history of money laundering, racketeering, everything you can think of. All types of bribery, corruption, even murder. And so we see a wide variety of issues. So it behooves the board of directors to be protected, protect the shareholders of the company as well, and minimize issues of corruption at the top. You often speak about tone at the top. Yeah. That's another part of tone at the top. It's to have everyone screened. And we do have clients that screen their entire board of directors annually, which is really the right way to do it. So everyone, including the board.
Now let me turn to your company, because when I called to ask you to be on the podcast, you had some actually quite exciting things that were happening with your company. Sort of started with you were redoing your website. It's quite dynamic now, very impressive.
Thank you.
Tell us where Infratel's going. You had brought some folks on board, and actually very, very interesting. So what's going on?
Well, we're expanding our senior management team. We have our managing director of operations, Mike Brown, who's a wonderful asset to the company already, and our CFO started working with us on more of a full-time basis. We're expanding and looking at possible offices in the eastern part of the US, possibly Washington, D.C.,
wow.
And a quick launch to London. Obviously, that's where I'm from. It'd be nice to have an office there one day. So a lot of excitement building around our growth and around our clients' growth also. So we're very excited about that. And of course, our global footprint overall is expanding. We've always had the global reach and global capabilities in pretty much every country. Certainly about 120 countries that we've actually conducted various types of investigative work in.
Right. So now you're going to have the physical presence to actually reach out and touch those folks.
Yes, that's what we're looking for.
So
very exciting.
That's great. Candace, if anyone wanted to actually contact you based on what they've heard today, could they email you?
Oh yeah, of course.
What's your email address? ctal@infratel.com, ctal@infratel.com, and that's the website, of course, infortal.com. Look, I really appreciate you taking the time to visit with us today, and I look forward to hearing more about where you're going with your expansion. Hopefully we'll get to have our next chat in London.
That would be awesome, Tom. I look forward to that.
All right. Thanks, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and this has been the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report.